The deluge of rainfall that caused deadly floods last month in and around KwaZulu Natal was made twice as likely by global warming. Now, according to scientists under the World Weather Attribution consortium, without climate change, rain of this intensity would only happen roughly once every 40 years. Now, heavy downpours claimed hundreds of lives and caused billions in damage across KZN and Eastern Cape. Let's discuss this now further with climatologist Izidine Pinto. Dr. Pinto, thank you so much for joining us. You're with the University of Cape Town and an advisor for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre as well. We've seen research being served up in the wake of these devastating floods in KZN. And it's really no surprise, especially if you look at weather events happening across the world as we speak right now, that the human influence on climate change had a lot to do with the severity of these floods that we just recently experienced in KZN.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm Izidine, and thank you for the invite to talk about these devastating events that happen in KZN. So I'd like to say that this type of events, they can happen normally even without climate change. They are part of the natural variability of the climate. But nowadays, because currently we are at 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, and because of that, we are seeing that global warming or increases in global surface temperatures are affecting these kind of events worldwide. And for this particular event in KZN, our recent study found that climate change made these extreme rainfall that caused massive floods in KZN region heavier and more likely to happen. And from this study, we found that that the probability of such an event happening has nearly doubled due to climate change caused by greenhouse gas emissions. And this type of events in the past would not happen once every 20 years, will be once every 40 years.
Talk to me about the physics around this specific research, because the research says that in case of heavy rains, it said that that's basic physics. They say that every extra degree of global warming increases the amount of water in the atmosphere by about 7%. Can you explain to lay people the physics behind that?
Yes, that's what we call the Clausius-Clapeyron theorem, because every degree of increases in temperature, we see an increase in 7% of humidity. So it means that when we warm up the atmosphere, we have evaporation into the atmosphere, and that evaporation accounts for 7% of the vapor into the atmosphere. And because of that increases in moisture into the atmosphere, we're going to see more heavy rainfall events when they happen, so downpours. And for this particular event of the KZN case, we saw that climate change increased the intensity between 4 and 8% of magnitude of this event.
Now, we're talking about single-digit percentage points, but when we're speaking about weather events, even a 0.2% or 0.1% can be the difference between what's expected to be seasonal rainfall and the torrential rainfall or the floods that we saw. Why is it important to keep an eye even on every percentage point?
Yes, that's very important, because we are seeing that most of the time these type of events are causing disasters. But the disaster itself does not only depend on the hazard, in this case the heavy precipitation. We have to take into account the structural vulnerability, and most cities in Africa, we are seeing a rapid urban growth, and this urban growth with more people in the cities and informal settlements. So every percentage of increase in precipitation or heavy precipitation will have a negative impact on the population in the cities, for example, especially in informal settlements, because of their high vulnerability of this kind of events.
And it really is, unfortunately, a pattern that we see repeat over and over again. The vulnerable peoples across the world are the ones that are the hardest hit by these, I suppose scientists would say, not completely unexpected events, but the severity of the events really affects the vulnerable people, the poor, and the people living in very unequal societies, such as the one here in South Africa. It's a pattern that we seem to take note of, but governments or people in a position to make a difference don't seem to want to acknowledge and therefore put resources in that direction to prevent the kind of carnage that we've seen as a result of these climate change events.
Yes, definitely. Just to give an example, for example, Durban is in the forefront of mitigation and adaptation of climate change. But these plans are not yet put in action to adapt to the impact of climate change. And this type of events that we saw in recent KZN, they just came to bring the problem of inequality as one of the biggest problems in the region.
Now, according to this research, it says instead of this kind of rain happening roughly every 40 years, the probability of it doubles and you might see it every 20 years. But that doesn't mean that other severe weather events might not happen in that time. So we can't just say, oh, okay, so we're good. We can recover from this and we'll just expect it to happen again in 20 years. There are other severe weather events that could happen in the next 2 decades that we really need to prepare for as well, because climate change means that so many of regular weather events are now much more severe.
Yes, definitely. So this doesn't mean that this event will only happen once in 20 years. It can happen next year, an event, but with probably lower magnitude. For this specific event that happened in the KZN, we experienced rainfall over 2 days of above 300 millimeters in some of the stations. And this is very rare. But for this particular event, when we say once every 20 years, it means that the magnitude of that particular event, it has a probability of happen once every 20 years. But because of climate variability, it's possible for some events to happen next year or in 2 years or 3 years. And what is most important here is to reduce the vulnerability of the population in these areas.
And indeed to lean on the science, because the evidence is all there to guide us being able to prevent the severity of these events going forward. Now, the world, just in closing, the world's nations, there's a target of capping global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, although the average surface temperature of nearly 1.2%, you mentioned earlier, since the late 19th century. But we know with the really slow pace at which nations, especially governments, have been keen to make these changes, that cap or global cap of global warming at 1.5% is probably a soft target that will probably not be met. But if you look at the world's news, a week doesn't go by with us seeing a severe weather event hitting some part of the world. At the moment, there's a heat wave in large parts of India and Pakistan. That's over the last couple of months. That's just one of the stories that we've seen. There's been a record rainfall in Germany and Belgium, and the list goes on. What do we need to see happen immediately? Forgetting what targets for global warming there is, what do we need to be seeing happening immediately from an international perspective to really start putting us in the right direction to prevent the impact and the severity of these world weather events?
That's a very difficult question.
I know. These events, see what you can do for me.
Yes, these events that are happening every year in South Africa, Pakistan, and Germany, they're just showing us the urgency that we need to reduce the greenhouse gases so we can lower or meet the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Otherwise, if we pass that threshold, we're going to see more devastating disasters around the world.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate that insight and your expertise. That's climatologist Izidine Pinto, Dr. Izidine Pinto. He's with the University of Cape Town, and he's also an advisor for the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Centre, really sending out some important warnings if we don't want to see a repeat of the impact of those devastating floods in KZN.